Good evening, and thank you for joining us. Tonight, we are following a fragile pause in the conflict between the United States and Iran, with both sides now facing a critical question. Can diplomacy keep the Strait of Hormuz open and prevent another dangerous escalation in the Gulf? The Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most important shipping routes. It is a narrow waterway between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula that connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the wider world. A significant share of global oil and liquefied natural gas exports pass through it. When shipping is threatened there, the effects can reach far beyond the Middle East, influencing fuel prices, financial markets, supply chains, and the broader global economy. The latest round of indirect talks between the United States and Iran concluded in Doha, Qatar, this week. According to Reuters, the discussions focused heavily on maritime traffic through the Strait of Hormuz and on financial incentives sought by Iran. The talks did not appear to produce a clear breakthrough toward a lasting peace agreement, but they did preserve a channel for communication at a moment when both countries have already exchanged military strikes. The current negotiations are tied to a 14-point interim agreement reached last month. That framework was intended to halt fighting, reopen the Strait of Hormuz to commercial shipping, and create time for broader negotiations. Those broader talks are expected to address the underlying disputes that helped drive the conflict, including Iran's nuclear program, regional security, sanctions, and the future role of outside powers in the Gulf. But the ceasefire remains under pressure. In recent days, the United States and Iran have publicly disagreed over what the interim agreement actually requires. According to preliminary reports, those disagreements were followed by tit-for-tat military action in and around the Gulf. A U.S. official said both sides later agreed to halt recent attacks and return to negotiations. That agreement reduced the immediate risk of a wider confrontation, but it did not resolve the core disputes. For Washington, the central objective is clear: keep commercial shipping moving freely through the Strait of Hormuz and prevent Iran from using the waterway as leverage in future negotiations. U.S. officials have long argued that international shipping lanes should remain open, and that no single country should be able to impose new restrictions or fees on vessels using a route that is vital to the global economy. Iran, however, has taken a different position. Reuters reported that Iranian officials are seeking greater recognition of Tehran's authority over the strait and have discussed the possibility of imposing fees on ships entering or leaving the Gulf. Iranian leaders have also argued that the country's security concerns must be addressed, particularly after months of military pressure and attacks involving the United States, Israel, and Iran's regional allies. That disagreement goes to the heart of the talks. The United States wants predictable, open passage for commercial vessels. Iran wants guarantees, recognition of its security role, and economic relief. Both sides may see diplomacy as preferable to renewed fighting, but they are still far apart on what a final agreement should look like. The timeline of this conflict helps explain why the negotiations are so difficult. The current war began earlier this year after U.S. and Israeli strikes inside Iran, according to Reuters reporting. Those strikes were linked to concerns over Iran's nuclear activities and broader regional security. Iran responded with military action, and the conflict expanded across the region. The Strait of Hormuz quickly became one of the most sensitive pressure points because of its importance to global energy supplies. By June, international mediators were working to establish a ceasefire framework. Pakistan and Qatar have played important diplomatic roles, helping facilitate contacts between Washington and Tehran. The interim agreement announced last month was meant to provide a 60-day window for negotiations and reduce the risk of another regional war. But agreements on paper do not always translate into stability on the water. Shipping companies, insurers, oil traders, and governments are all watching the Strait of Hormuz closely. Even when vessels are technically allowed to pass, the threat of attacks, seizures, mines, drones, or missile strikes can raise insurance costs and lead shipping firms to reroute vessels or delay departures. Those disruptions can reduce the flow of oil and gas even without a formal closure of the waterway. That is why markets reacted so closely to news from Doha. Reuters reported that oil prices fell after signs of progress in the U.S.-Iran talks eased concerns about supply disruptions. But the decline in prices also reflects how quickly markets can change direction. If the ceasefire collapses or shipping is disrupted again, energy prices could rise sharply. For American consumers, the consequences could show up at gas stations, in airline ticket prices, and in the cost of goods transported by sea. The United States produces large amounts of oil, but it remains connected to the global energy market. When oil prices rise internationally, American households and businesses can still feel the impact. The political stakes in Washington are also significant. President Donald Trump has said the United States is making progress on possible limits to Iran's nuclear program. The administration is under pressure to show that military action and diplomatic engagement are producing a clear outcome. Supporters of the president argue that a firm approach has pushed Iran back to the negotiating table and created an opportunity for a more durable agreement. Critics, including some lawmakers and foreign policy analysts, are likely to question whether the administration has defined a realistic end goal. They argue that an interim ceasefire is not the same as a lasting settlement and warn that the United States could become drawn into another prolonged conflict in the Middle East. Congress is also expected to remain focused on the costs, legal authority, and strategic purpose of U.S. military involvement. Lawmakers from both parties have historically differed over how much power a president should have to use force abroad without a new authorization from Congress. Those debates could intensify if fighting resumes. In Iran, the political pressure is different, but equally intense. Iranian leaders must balance the need to protect the country's economy and avoid deeper military damage with domestic demands to resist U.S. pressure. Any agreement that appears to limit Iran's sovereignty or reduce its influence in the Gulf could face strong opposition from hardline political and military figures. At the same time, Iran's economy has been strained by years of sanctions and isolation. Access to frozen assets and the ability to sell energy products more freely are major incentives for Tehran to continue talking. Reports from the Doha discussions indicate that financial issues are among the central subjects being considered. Internationally, the response has been cautious. Gulf Arab states have a direct interest in preventing further attacks near their coastlines and keeping energy exports moving. European governments are concerned about both energy security and the risk that a wider war could trigger another humanitarian crisis. Asian countries, many of which rely heavily on oil and gas shipments from the Gulf, are also watching closely. China, India, Japan, South Korea, and other major energy importing nations have strong economic reasons to support a stable agreement. A prolonged disruption in the Strait of Hormuz could affect global growth, increase inflation, and complicate economic policy in countries far from the Middle East. The role of mediators may become even more important in the coming days. Qatar has hosted indirect discussions, while Pakistan has been involved in efforts to keep communication open. These countries do not control the decisions made in Washington or Tehran, but they can provide a place for negotiations when direct contact is politically difficult. The next test will be whether technical talks can lead to practical rules that both sides can accept. That could include procedures for commercial ships, communication channels to avoid accidental clashes, and commitments to avoid attacks near the waterway. Such steps would not solve every dispute between the United States and Iran, but they could reduce the chance that a single incident turns into a larger military confrontation. The larger challenge remains Iran's nuclear program. The interim agreement was supposed to create room for negotiations on that issue, but Reuters reported that the Doha talks focused more on maritime traffic and financial questions than on the nuclear dispute itself. That suggests the most difficult issues may still be ahead. For now, the ceasefire is holding, but it is not secure. The United States and Iran have stepped back from immediate escalation, yet both sides remain armed, suspicious, and deeply divided over the terms of any lasting settlement. The Strait of Hormuz remains the clearest measure of whether diplomacy is working. If ships move freely, tensions ease, and talks continue, the chances of avoiding another round of fighting improve. If shipping is threatened again, the risk of escalation could return quickly. That is the latest on this developing story. We'll continue to follow any new developments as they become available. Thank you for watching.